Good morning. My name is Jonathan Lord, and I'm the Senior Fellow and the Director of the Middle East Security Program here at the Center for New American Security. In 2022, the Biden administration released a national defense strategy which identified China as America's pacing challenge, Russia an acute threat, and Iran, North Korea, and violent extremist organizations like ISIS as threats needing to be contained. Bipartisan recognition of the challenge posed by China and Russia in their respective areas of influence, along with effective implementation of the strategy, has resulted in a whole-of-government reprioritization toward the Indo-Pacific and European theaters. However, beginning at least 24 months ago, and arguably even earlier, we began to notice a disconcerting trend. America's top adversaries and competitors increasingly were finding ways to collaborate, bringing to bear their respective competencies and competitive advantages to collude and assist each other in ways that parochially benefited their respective regional hegemonic aims and collectively work to challenge the rules-based order which has allowed the United States and free nations around the world to succeed and prosper since the end of the Second World War. Iran has provided deadly drones and missiles to Russia in support of Russia's illegal war of aggression in Ukraine. Russia has reciprocated by offering advanced conventional weapon systems to Iran. China has become Iran's primary energy customer, procuring oil and petrochemicals in contravention of U.S. sanctions. North Korea and China have helped reconstitute Russia's military capacity, which had been heavily attrited during the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. In the wake of October 7th, the steady escalation of violence in the Middle East by Iran and its proxies and partners has further highlighted the impacts of the Axis, as the Houthis and Hezbollah have reportedly received training from Russia, and the Houthis have attempted to avoid targeting Russian and Chinese surface ships in the Red Sea while attacking those of other nations almost indiscriminately. The methods and depths of collaboration continue to expand between these revisionist powers, which together we at CNAS have termed the axis of upheaval. To discuss this axis and what might be done to address this developing threat, I'm pleased to welcome to CNAS Representatives Adam Smith and Rob Wittman. Mr. Smith represents Washington State's 9th Congressional District, serving parts of King County, including South Seattle, Renton, Bellevue, and Federal Way. Having served on the House Armed Services Committee since 1997, Ranking Member Smith served as the chairman of the full committee from 2019 to 2023. He formerly chaired the subcommittee on Air and Land Forces and Terrorism and Unconventional Threats and Capabilities, respectively. Ranking Member Smith has also previously served on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Mr. Wittman represents Virginia's 1st District, containing portions of the Richmond suburbs, Hampton Roads area, and the Northern Neck and Middle Peninsula. He serves as Vice Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee and the Chairman of the Tactical Air and Land Forces Subcommittee. Mr. Wittman also serves on the House Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. He also currently serves on the U.S. Naval Academy's Board of Visitors. I'll now turn to the members to offer their opening remarks, but before I do, I'd like to remind our virtual audience they can ask questions at cnas.org/live or on X and LinkedIn using the hashtag CNAS2024. I'll also be looking to our in-person audience for questions as well. Mr. Smith, Mr. Wittman, welcome to CNAS.
Great to be here, Jonathan. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I think Jonathan gave a pretty good summary of the challenge that we face. The unprecedented aspect of it is the degree to which our adversaries are beginning to cooperate. And I think this is the defining national security challenge that we have, how to counter that. And the one thing to keep in mind, there are differences, certainly, between China and Russia and Iran and North Korea and the various violent extremist groups that are out there. They don't agree on everything, certainly, but they agree on one thing. Their mission is to reduce U.S. power and to push us out of a variety of different places in the world. Really, at the end of the day, that's what has allowed them to come together in a way that they haven't before. They see it as a zero-sum game. If an action lessens our power and influence in the world, it's good for all of them. And crucially, they have developed a very clear message that you see from RT to Chinese propaganda to Iranian propaganda to a lot of the propaganda put out by terrorist groups like Hamas, the Houthis, and others. And that is that the U.S. is an evil imperialistic power trying to force itself upon the rest of the world, and they must be driven out. They are increasingly coordinated in that message. And our mission is to counter that. and we are not similarly coordinated in our message. And I would say that's the #1 biggest thing that we need to do in the U.S. is see that threat clearly, and Jonathan explained it quite well, and then decide what is our message going to be to counter that, and then to try to rally the world to that cause. Now, in some ways, we have had some success. We still have a lot more partners and allies and a lot more capable relationships in Asia, with NATO, with the Quad, with AUKUS, with a whole bunch of different policies. We do have that advantage, so we need to continue to strengthen those alliances. The one area, and there's a whole bunch of other things to say, but I want to get into questions, so I'll close with this. The one area where I think we are really falling behind is with the non-aligned states, the undecided voters, if you will. When you look at how we're going to influence this policy, how are we going to block what Russia's trying to do in Eastern Europe, what China's trying to do in Asia, what both of them are doing in Africa and Latin America? How are we going to turn back the tide of Iran's influence in the Middle East as they destabilize governments in Lebanon and Yemen and Syria and Iraq? Well, a lot of it is going to have to do with what India and Brazil and Argentina and South Africa and Nigeria and Saudi Arabia and those countries that don't directly align with either side of this discussion. What do they do? Do they help with sanctions against Russia? You know, who do they link their economies to? Do they buy their military equipment from? How do they vote in the UN? Those are the countries that we need to figure out how to work better with and to get them to see that this, what do you call it, the axis of upheaval?
I did.
My staff and I we called it the CRINGE: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and global extremist groups. I think I like the axis of upheaval better, actually. You know, if we're going to be able to slow them down, we're going to need to be able to convince these non-aligned countries that what the CRINGE, or the axis of upheaval, is doing is not just a threat to the U.S., but it is a threat to them as well. Us showing up and saying, oh my gosh, these groups are undermining what we're doing in the world. You know, the folks in, like, I don't know, Uruguay or wherever are going to go, yeah, so? Okay, well, how's that affect me? We've got to get better at showing that the rules-based international order that we want to try and enforce and make work in the world works for them, not just for us. So we've really got to work on that message and on growing our partnerships and alliances. Thank you.
Well, Jonathan, thank you, and thank you to the Center for New American Security. Listen, I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. Adam, thank you so much for being part of this. I think it's a very important moment in history, and history does teach us that we've been through these periods of time before. As it's been referred to, the axis of upheaval, we've seen the emergence of axis of evil back in the late 1930s, 1938, 1939. We saw what the world did at that particular point to come together. That is, those nations that believed in the rule of law, believed in protecting the rights of human beings, believed in protecting the environment. We find ourselves at that same crossroads today, where we have nations that do not believe in the same things that we believe in, do not believe in the rule of law, do not believe in protecting the rights and dignity of human beings, do not believe in protecting the environment. Those are things that unite many of us, and as Adam talked about, those are the efforts that we need to talk to other nations about. They may have some differences in how we achieve those ends, but I think the majority of countries on this planet believe in the same things that we believe in. But it's counter to what Russia and China and North Korea and Iran and these violent extremist groups believe in. They believe in something very different. They are not in favor of the rule of law. They do not value the rights of human beings. They do not value the resources that they have and that they want to exploit others. You know, our challenge is how do we make sure that we come together with other nations that feel the same way? We have good relationships. As Adam said, we can do better there. The challenge for us, too, is to make sure we understand that for many nations that are being confronted, especially by China, you know, China is a transactional coercionist. They look to come in and threaten countries and said, by the way, you know, our economy is going to dominate you if you don't capitulate and do what we tell you to do. And a great example is the directive that they issued just in July 10th, they issued a directive about what they're going to do to ban the export of technology and things like the production of rare earth magnets, to ban the export of rare earth elements. I mean, they are all in on this. They look to not just compete, they look to destroy other nations that will not capitulate. And they look to use that position elsewhere in the world. You look at also what they're doing to work together with like nations, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. That should concern us. We still have an advantage in the relationships we have with our friends, but they get it. They understand the power of relationships. What should also concern us is the geographic proximity of those nations. So strategically, that gives them some advantages that we haven't seen in the past with other times in our history when we've seen other nations that have ideas in common that are counter to what the United States and our friends believe in. The one advantage that we do have is we've operated with our friends for much longer periods of time, which means the interoperability with us and our friends is better than with Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. But do not mistake what they will do to try to improve that interoperability. Do not mistake what they're doing to try to provide help to others. I mean, we'll look just at what's happening in Ukraine. I just got back from there. When you look at the components of unmanned aerial vehicles that Russia's sending into Ukraine, you look at the parts in those vehicles. When they get shot down, you look at it, Chinese semiconductors, Chinese circuit boards. So they're not providing direct help, but indirect support. So all the things that go into destabilizing the world, they are a part of. And it suits their means to be able to do that. Because what they want to do is to be able to undermine other people's confidence in what the United States and our partners can do. And if they're successful in doing that, then what they choose to do is to say, by the way, you know, do the things that we want you to do, because we will hold control over you, and we want to show you that the United States can't do all the things that you believe that they can do. So it's both undermining confidence around the world in the United States and our allies, but it's also through transactional coercion for them to be able to use that relationship with others to force them to do things that otherwise they wouldn't do, but they feel compelled because they don't feel like they have a choice. The United States needs to continue with our partners to make sure these other nations have a choice to side with nations that believe in the rule of law, that believe in the rights and dignity of human beings, that believe in protecting the resources that we all have a responsibility to protect. Those things are fundamental, and they really need to be the defining point between nations like Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and the rest of the free world.
Thank you very much, and I'll look to the audience for questions in just a moment, but I am hearing this theme about partnership, which rings true, and something that I've been thinking about along with colleagues here is we're coming up on our next National Defense Strategy cycle. You know, it used to be called the Quadrennial Defense Review, NDS, every 4 years. And the last two, both Republican and Democrat, largely focused on the same priorities, and successfully so. But now that we see those priority adversaries and competitors working in new ways together, I think what the next National Defense Strategy will need to focus on is how we do animate our own partnerships and alliances to confront and make dilemmas for that axis. And in my own conversations with some of our closest partners, putting aside the Global South and those who might have relationships on both sides, it's almost been this grieving process where there's been a degree of denial and then anger and ultimately acceptance. I think of the Israelis in particular that always tried to maintain a degree of relationship with Russia and China, but particularly in the case of Russia, over time have had to make the point again and again that your adversary Iran is a real threat. And the Russians have made a choice. To make an omelet, you've got to break some eggs. And in this case, Israel, you are the egg. They're going to supply Iran with what they need in exchange for getting Shahed 136 drones. Now we have Fatah 360 short-range ballistic missiles going into Russia. They have made their choice. And I think there's a host of partners and allies who are still coming to grips with the fact that these adversaries are working in this way, not against just our interests, but they absolutely implicate their security in their regions of the world too. And the Gulf is another great example, where a lot of illicit transactions still occur and sanctions busting that enable Iran to do what it does. But the weapons that are built or designed in Tehran that then get mass-produced in Tatarstan, Russia, aren't just going to stay in Europe. They're going to proliferate back and threaten our partners in the region, just like we saw the Abqaiq and Quraysh Saudi Aramco attack in 2019 from Iranian drones, and situations like that, and the Houthis on top of that besides. So when we think of this next strategy, as we try to formulate what comes, what are the ways, the whole of government approaches by which we animate and electrify these partnerships in support of this, call it a counter-axis, call it an alliance as opposed to an axis. But from a legislative perspective, from a strategy perspective, if you're in the White House, how do we begin that process?
Listen, I think it has to begin economically. That's the basis of interest that joins all of us together. How do we work within that realm to make sure that we do things that are mutually beneficial? How do we make sure the United States does things with our economy that help others? And in today's world, there are a number of places where we find ourselves in a position that is very different than the Cold War. You know, the Cold War was between Russia and the United States. The Russians did not believe in free market economies, and they were somewhat isolated economically. Both China, Russia, and others today understand that, you know, we live in a world economy, and they are finding ways, either around sanctions or finding ways to be able to transactionally coerce other nations economically. We have the idea that we want mutually beneficial relationships. We should play upon that. That is a strength of ours. And what is happening in the United States, too, is we have forgotten the value chain. We have forgotten the things that need to happen, from the very birth of materials to the end product where those materials are produced, to even the recycling of those materials. We've allowed China to dominate in that space. And because of that, China is now able to control things in ways that are never going to be in our interest, or are the interest of themselves, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. So we have to make sure we're working with our friends and allies on things like critical minerals and rare earth elements. We are really at a tipping point when it comes to that. We have friends around the world that have great technologies, that have resources, that will not exploit human beings, that will not destroy environments, that believe in the rule of law. Those are our strengths, and we need to play to those, and we need to get over, you know, what our adversaries are doing, and look at those relationships and build upon those relationships. And those economic relationships that are built will then lead naturally into stronger strategic relationships. That's the process that we have to go through in order to make sure that we have what's necessary to sustain this effort in the long term. If it's just a strategic relationship, if it's just mill to mill, those things take time, and many times they're not always perfectly aligned. It's much easier to first align and coordinate the economic relationships, and then those things make it much easier to do the things necessary strategically to counter these axes of upheaval, or I call them axes of evil. So.
Yeah, no, I think there's a couple things. One thing we're doing reasonably well, a couple others we're really not at the moment. The one thing, we are doing a reasonable job of, you know, the partners and alliances piece, as I mentioned earlier, in a bunch of different ways. We are, I think, understanding that and beginning to build, you know, certainly we saw a 54-nation coalition around Ukraine, a lot of the partnerships down in Asia. I mentioned the Quad and AUKUS, but also we were improving relationships with Japan and Vietnam and the Philippines, a whole bunch of other, you know, sort of different pieces of that that are going reasonably well. The second thing we need to do is to figure out, well, actually, one of the other things that we're doing okay is de-risking from China a little bit, because you got to understand, from like the mid-90s forward, China, the way I like to refer to it is, it was the global corporate easy button. It's where everybody went. Cheap labor, no environmental regulations, massive market, let's go there. So as a result, we became really dependent upon them for a whole bunch of different things. We're starting to move away from that. You're seeing India, Vietnam, you're seeing back home here in Mexico. You know, we're looking at other places, so we're not as dependent on China. We're sort of slowly creeping in the right direction on that. But the third thing is, you know, defense production specifically. And there, I think we're moving in the right direction, but really slowly. We are not producing enough of the weapons that we need to be an adequate deterrence. There's also the whole issue of innovation and technology, which I'll get into later. But we're seeing in Ukraine, how do we produce enough weapons to fight the fight in Ukraine and still have enough to deter? We're going to need partners for that. We're not going to be able to do it in the U.S. And the last piece is what I alluded to earlier that we're doing a truly terrible job of, and that is convincing the rest of the world that A, this is a fight that really, really matters to them, and B, that we're the right side of that fight. I think we take for granted that we're the U.S., we're better than they are. Most of the rest of the world doesn't look at it that way. We got a little bit of a mixed record over the course of the last 75 years. Now, I'll take us over them every day of the week, and so should anybody for a whole bunch of different reasons. But I mean, you walk into a country, and I've made the exact same point that Rob made, so I'm not being critical about how China uses economic coercion and locks these smaller countries into debt traps and abuses their economic power for their personal gain. And most of Latin America is going to look at us and just start laughing. Okay, it's like, yeah, where have we seen that before? You guys, okay, back in the 70s and 80s when you sucked us all into that. A little bit of humility as we look at the rest of the world, I think would be useful because, again, for all of our faults and flaws and whatever we've done in the last 75 years, we are orders of magnitude better than Russia and China and Iran and all of those countries. But when we go and work with these countries and we're trying to convince them to be on our side of the economic divide, but by the way, one of the big things that these countries are doing is they're trying to undermine our economic power. And we have an enormous amount of economic power. The dollar is the reserve currency. We control the banking system. We have the ability to choke people off fairly quickly. And they're trying to get around that. That's the whole point of the BRICS, okay, is to build up that balance. If we're going to stop that from happening, we're going to need some of these other countries to be on our side, and it's not going to be enough to show up and say, hey, we're the U.S., we're better than they are, you have to be with us. We got a lot of work to do on that messaging piece.
I think we're going to take a question from our audience. Will H. asks, the threat of unmanned aircraft systems continues to grow around the world. How are you thinking about countering this threat to American and allied forces? And it's a great question. I remember back, when I was working for you gentlemen, it might have been my second year on committee staff, the FY21 bill, part of CENTCOM's unfunded priorities list. No comment on whether we should have UFIRs or not, but different discussion. I believe it was General McKenzie's first year, counter UAS. Was perhaps the only ask he had from CENTCOM that wasn't funded, and from there we've seen an explosion in this trend of UAS systems around the world in conflicts virtually everywhere.
Well, I think the issue's broader, and that gets me into what I said I was going to get into later, and now is later. We need to innovate and use technology better. We did this field hearing out in Silicon Valley on Monday that Mike Rogers led, and the whole theme of that was we've got all these innovative technologies that are crucial to defense at this point. Things are moving forward rapidly, and the Department of Defense is terrible at innovating. They're terrible at buying software. They're terrible at making the sort of quick adaptive decisions that are necessary. UAS is but the tip of the iceberg, okay? Secure communications. How do you make sure that your weapon systems still function if somebody's trying to block you, okay? How do we buy those new technologies? The counter-drone capability, missile defense, all of that. We need to get a lot better at it and move a lot more quickly. And I can tell you this is a bipartisan priority. The only person I can think of who feels more passionately about this subject than I do is Mike Rogers. And so no matter how this comes out, we're going to try to figure out how to rework the Pentagon, change the requirements process, build more flexibility into it, reward risk instead of sticking to process. This is the key to getting after precisely that issue because, it has really changed the battlefield. I mean, the barriers to entry for adversaries are so much lower than they used to be. I mean, just look at the Houthis. I can't think of a poorer or more backward country than Yemen, and here they are. They're able to generate the missiles. They're able to generate the drones to threaten us. We need to get a lot smarter about how we counter that.
Listen, I think the fundamental place that we find ourselves today is technology changes the world quickly, literally in seconds, in minutes. And we need to be able to operate at the speed of relevance That's not the Pentagon's strong suit. Just as Adam said, they are process-centric instead of outcome-centric. And here's the transition that we need to make. Listen, this nation has been used to saying we're going to build very advanced, exquisite platforms that take years and years to write requirements, years and years to acquire, billions and billions of dollars to put in place, billions and billions of dollars to maintain. We no longer have the time nor the money to stay solely on that course. This has to be an and proposition. We have to do exquisites, and we need those, but we have to, at the speed of relevance, add attritable platforms and expendable platforms. The laboratory for how that's unfolding is in Ukraine. And we see, too, other folks around the world are learning the same lesson, and China's watching, too. So the question is how do we make that transition quickly? The way that we close the gap with the Chinese is to be able to feel those systems faster than they feel them. And another thing, too, is the Pentagon, through its entire history, has been a hardware-centric organization. They're great at acquiring hardware. You know, they take new technology by bits and bits and bits, and then they put it in place. But the problem is, by the time it gets put in place, it's on the edge of relevance. F-35 is a great example. Listen, F-35, a very advanced aircraft, but you cannot take 23 years, which is where we are today, from a clean sheet of paper to now maximum production, and expect that you are going to be anywhere close to your adversary.
Not maximum production now.
Not now. That's right. That's right. But
still getting there.
Still getting there.
Yeah,
that's right. Yes. But on the precipice of maximum production, you can't do that. If you look at where we need to be today, again, speed of relevance matters. Being able to make the most of your resources matters. It's a competition, not just strategically, but how do we get more per our dollar than the Chinese get per their yuan? So we have to also change the mindset. That hardware-centric mindset is something that I think is holding the Pentagon back. We live in a software-based world, and as we talk about AI and quantum computing, it will be even more software-based. The Pentagon needs to move from a hardware-centric organization to a software-centric organization. And that software then can enable platforms. Listen, you know, the F-35 is a very good platform, but how it will be enabled to meet the challenges of the future is through software. And how do we make sure we get better at doing software? How do we make sure that everything we do is using digital twin technology, integrated software platforms? Those are the things of the future. The Pentagon doesn't even know how to acquire software. So it's not a matter of, hey, do we use software? It's they can't even acquire it. Because the companies that are out there saying, hey, we got a great software suites for you, the Pentagon goes, well, yeah, we'll do that via cost plus. And they go, sorry, we don't operate that way, so we're not interested. So then the Pentagon's losing all these opportunities. The Pentagon has to change its mindset. And Adam hit the nail on the head. Every day the Pentagon needs to ask themselves, everybody in the Pentagon needs to ask themselves 3 questions. First of all, was my sole priority today to follow process? Answer that question. Answer the second question. Was my sole focus today to help the warfighter? Third question, was my sole focus today to deter our adversaries? If you answer yes to the first question and no to the second 2 questions, then maybe you need to find another career. You need to answer no to the first one and yes to the second 2. That's the course that we need to be on.
Well, and one other aspect of that is the way the development of missiles and drones have made so many things so much more vulnerable than they used to be. Whether you're talking, I mean, that's one of the great problems of the F-35. I mean, it was designed to be a stealth fighter that could penetrate into contested environments. And now it really can't, okay? Because those contested environments have got so much better at finding and hitting targets. How does that change what we need to be investing in? To make sure that we can protect the targets we need to protect. Maybe it's redundancy. You know, maybe you need 5,000 things that are attritable. There's a whole bunch of different possible answers to that. But in addition to everything Rob said, we also need to be thinking, you know, creatively about solving the problems that now present themselves that 20 years ago would have been unimaginable. And now we're living that world, and we're still based on this, you know. It's not quite 20 years ago that we're living out the plan now, but it's 5 years ago, 5-year plans, and it changes so much, and we're locked into these plans that were made so that now they're not even relevant. So we need to be able to move quicker.
I know I have a question, but I think we'd take some from our audience. Mona.
Do I need a mic?
Coming your way.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll wait.
And if you just stand up, introduce yourself.
go to peace. I'd like to pick up on this last thread of discussion, and draw it specifically to the Middle East. It appears that deterrence has utterly broken down in the Middle East. And we do see the very dangerous levels of cooperation between Russia and Iran. In particular, I'd like to ask both of you, how do we upgrade models of deterrence in the Middle East to meet these new threats? You've talked about counter-drone technology, which makes great sense, but what else can and should the U.S. be doing to address this dangerous new phase we find ourselves in?
Well, listen, I think it begins with being more effective on the economic front. You know, as we look at sanctions, the sanctions really haven't worked. These countries have become very adept at sidestepping sanctions. If you look at the most immediate impact, things that have the greatest ability to affect behavior, it really begins with economic sanctions. And just as Adam said, other friends around the world have to help us with that. And we have to be staunch in our resolve to stick by those sanctions. And, you know, if we weaken that or say, well, they're bypassing the sanctions, but we kind of did our first job to put the sanctions in place, we really won't worry about the enforcement of the sanctions. We have to be all in. If you're going to make that decision to sanction, you have to say, we're all in. We're going to make sure the sanctions are important. That has the most, I think, immediate impact on these nations. You know, the other elements to strategically deter them for us and others take time. Another thing we need to be aware of, too, is that we need to think more out into the windshield. You know, we've always looked in this country and said, we're the leaders in technology, so we just take the best technology now and we write a requirement and we go through the acquisition process and then we put that technology in place. The problem is that in today's world, by the time you get the technology in place, it's already outdated. And then, too, we look at it and sometimes arrogantly think, we're the only ones that can create this stuff. And what we find is, no, that's not the case. And instead of looking in the windshield and going, you know, if we create something, what would the countermeasures be? And understanding what the countermeasures would be, what would we do then to say, well, how do we get in front of those countermeasures? Instead of saying, we're so superior, we just create something and it'll never be a problem. You know, we have to be more visionary in what we do, and we have to be resolved that if we're going to use economic sanctions, daggone it, stick with them and strictly enforce them.
Bigger points. First of all, it's not true that deterrence has completely failed in the Middle East. The deterrence is still a pretty major factor right now. Now, I'll knock on wood as I say that because if I get off the stage, who knows? But, you know, Iran and Hezbollah are both in a position to rain serious harm down on Israel. They have the missiles, they have the technology, they have the capability. Despite everything that has happened, and you know a lot has happened in Gaza, in Syria, in Tehran, in Lebanon, in Israel, the war has not both sides are not throwing everything they've got at it. Okay, so let's not, you know, people, well, deterrence didn't work because people are fighting. Yeah, I worry about that. Okay, so if we decided deterrence doesn't work, what's your alternative? And I know you had an alternative, but before we walk too far down the road where deterrence isn't working, understand that the threat that the U.S. presents by having the aircraft carrier battle groups there and all this stuff has been a big part of what has deterred this thing from stumbling into a full-on war. So that's one point. The second point, in the Middle East, the only adequate deterrence is the plan that we had, which is basically to use partners and allies to stand against Iran. And the path to that is the path that we were trying to walk down, which is a peace agreement basically between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the U.S. But you would also throw UAE and Jordan and Egypt and others into that so that you could build this coalition to deter Iran. Now, the major impediment to that path, in my view, well, major impediment, that's unfair. One of the major impediments is Iran. Iran is the biggest impediment, obviously causing problems with Hamas and Hezbollah and all. But the impediment to building this coalition that would go up against all the terrible stuff that Iran is doing, so please don't say, oh, Adam Smith said it's not Iran's fault. It is Iran's fault. But to counter Iran, there has to be a future for the Palestinian people. And Benjamin Netanyahu's vision that somehow he's going to get that deal with Saudi Arabia and all of these Arab states and be able to completely ignore the Palestinians, a vision he's had for, I think, as long as he's been alive, and certainly for the last 15 years, it's not going to work. If we don't find some way to get Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the U.S. to get to this agreement, I don't think we have much of a hope for adequate deterrence there. And that path involves some kind of future for the Palestinian people. Now, it can't be Hamas, I understand that, but you can't reject every possible alternative and get somewhere. And the last point I want to make in the economic sanctions thing, the logical extension of what I'm saying, if we really lean into the economic sanctions, the way you do it is you don't just sanction the country you're going after. You sanction every single country that does business with them. And there is risk in that. Risk to what I said earlier about the only reason that we're able to do that is because the rest of the world has consented to allow us to run the world, basically to run the economic system. And if we start making them pay a really high price, they're going to accelerate their efforts to find an alternative. So, that's a difficult thing to balance, in my view.
I would be remiss in my role as director of the Middle East Security Program if I did not mention that next month we actually have a report coming out very much on the subject of what you described, Mr. Smith. What is the next national security paradigm for Israel that does recreate a pathway back to a two-state solution and then does enable the introduction of a new alliance in the Middle East with the U.S. at the center to do just what you've described. So I do too. We'll turn to another question in the audience. Dr. Danya Thaffer, good to see you. We have a mic coming. Please stand up and introduce yourself.
Hello. Hello, Congressman. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for having me. I'm Danya Dhafar. I'm the Executive Director at Gulf International Forum. So as you know, Jonathan, I focus heavily on the Gulf, and I spent my summer there this summer as someone coming from the U.S., and it was a very, very tough summer based on what's going on in the region. And actually, in the spring, I went to China with some people from the Gulf. Many of them are close to the leaders in the Gulf and all of that. And I would have to say the conversation has changed tremendously with the Chinese. There's much more closer involvement with the Chinese people. The Chinese, I have never seen them so charismatic in my life about the Middle East. And I think many of the leaders in the Gulf are buying it. As you know, since the Gaza war started, the first visit for the Gulf states was China. Also, I think the deal between Iran and the Gulf states, that was facilitated by China, not mediated by China. And so I'm actually very curious to see what is the strategy for the Middle East in terms of countering China, because I don't see a winning strategy here. There's been the most diplomatic visits between the Chinese and the Gulf states in its history. Saudi Arabian students are now learning Chinese in their schools. So I don't see that the U.S. strategy is winning in the region, unfortunately. And I would really like to hear your perspectives, especially Congressman. You talked about non-aligned states and the view of the people. Thank you.
No, I think you correctly identify a major problem. And I think one of the things, and I'll just start the argument here, we are presenting to the world this as a zero-sum game to a large degree. You're with us or you're with China. I think that's a mistake, okay? China's not going anywhere. And we've had this debate, we've had this argument, and I am deeply in the minority on this point. I believe Mike Gallagher and Matthew Pottinger, both of whom I have a lot of respect for, wrote a piece saying we don't need to compete with China, we need to win. I think that is just completely wrong. Okay, I think taking that approach is a recipe for disaster. All right, China is not going anywhere. All right, they are a major, major economic power with influence over the globe, which the height of the Soviet Union they couldn't even touch. All right, so I guess I'll just say, while we are talking about constantly what is your strategy for confronting China, that is the debate. I always ask the question, what is your strategy for coexisting with China? Because if you don't have one, we're in big trouble. Because going into Saudi Arabia and UAE and all the other countries in the Arab states and saying, don't do business with China, that's not going to work. All right? We have to figure out how we can coexist peacefully with China while China is not as actively working against our interests. And then we have to, at the same time, offer some value to these states. And again, we were on a better path, obviously, before the Gaza war broke out. And the Gaza war is because of Hamas, no doubt about it, okay, and because of Iran, more centrally, and their destabilizing influence in the world. But to counter that, we need to collectively, with our very good partner Israel, come up with some solution for the Palestinian people that is plausible for the Arab world. And if we don't, we're just throwing the door wide open to China, okay, and giving them an opportunity to walk in. So those are the two approaches that I would take to try to reset, because fundamentally, you're right. China's growing in the Middle East, and we're shrinking. And it's a problem. We are not winning that competition right now.
Yeah, one thing that should concern us are the efforts of China, just as you speak, about going to the Middle East, being very charismatic and interacting with folks. So they've seen their mistakes of the past and how they've been more transactional and how they deal with things. Now they're looking at it in a different light. That should concern all of us, and it should heighten our awareness, but it should also heighten our efforts to know that nations like Saudi Arabia are going to be one of the linchpins in the future for the Middle East. And how do we make sure that we equally engage? I would argue that we can do it even more effectively than the Chinese in painting a vision about what the future would be in the Middle East and the things that we can do constructively with other countries there that believe in the same thing that we believe in, and countering the malign influence from Iran. I mean, that's really what this is all about. And China is trying to convince them, hey, listen, you're better off by, putting some chips on the table with us rather than all chips in the stack with the United States. So, they're playing this game of poker, and they've got plenty of chips to play that game with. So we need to be aware of that. We need to be cognizant of that. We need to be more effective in what we do in the Middle East, and especially in understanding all the dynamics that go on there, the dynamics of what's happening now in Israel, the dynamics between the three H's, Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas, and understanding, too, what Iran is doing, trying to destabilize that. I mean, they've been at this game for years, trying to make sure that they increase their influence, that crescent that they seek to create in the region there. I mean, I think all those things are the reality about how Iran is operating. The question is we cannot just have a strategy of saying we're going to combat Iran. That's not a viable strategy. The strategy has to be, how do we build stronger relationships in competition with China, understanding how they operate with other nations in the Middle East? That's going to be our path forward. And I think we can do that more effectively than the Chinese, even though, let me tell you, they are very astute at watching the United States and understanding what has made us successful through the years. And my concern is they're getting good at replicating us. And we've seen in other circumstances they actually been able to learn and sometimes do things better than us. We better be on the same path of learning to make sure we keep ahead of the Chinese, because if we're complacent, we'll find ourselves in a bad place.
It's an important question. I just want to follow up a little bit on it. When I travel through the Middle East, I go through airports, and invariably I see Dajaj Kentucky, Kentucky chicken. So it's not as if we're not. Did I butcher it, or is it? We're not present economically. And historically, the relationship has been that we in the West have come to Gulf states looking for their investment from their sovereign wealth funds. But increasingly, the trend that I've seen to observed is that they're looking for capital investment from us in the West. And increasingly, their willingness to do business with us, with our defense industrial base, comes with strings. They want headquarters in their countries. They want some degree of technical transfer. They want production facilities in their countries as well. So when we think about that, in this case, I'm speaking specifically about the defense industrial base, but even more broadly, how do we begin to marshal our economic resources that direction? Because if you're China, it's very simple. You can just project your economic, it's not a free market economy. Yeah. You will invest here. Yeah. We don't have a system like that. So how do we begin to move or incentivize American capital to the Gulf.
Yeah. Listen, I think we have to take a more cooperative mindset. You know, we through the years have looked at it somewhat arrogantly and said, listen, we're the leader in innovation and technology. You know, we have all the good ideas, and we're going to fiercely protect them. We're not going to share anything with anybody else because we can't get to that level of trust. What we have to do is to be able to fix systems like ITAR. Listen, you know, and a great example is we have the new AUKUS agreement. It's only recently that we've actually fixed ITAR provisions to where we actually, you know, bring Australia up to the level that we treat Canada. Many other nations have said, hey, listen, at least share some technology with us, at least allow us to do some things cooperatively. The path forward for us to be able to deter our adversaries is we cannot do it all by ourselves. With the amount of debt that we're carrying right now, with the capacity for our economy to combat, you know, the economies of now 4 nations. This is not the Cold War. This is 4 different nations who are doing a lot there in that stream and are growing their economies. We can't do it by ourselves, and we have to be able to make sure that we're willing to share technology. Maybe not all the really good stuff, but we have to share some basic technology so these other nations can say, hey, the United States, trust us a little bit. They're going to let us use some of these things, and understand, too, there are some risks involved with that. But I argue the risk is greater if we don't move down that path versus moving down that path.
In violent agreement. Okay. I think we have time for another question or two. Maybe we could take the 2 in the back together.
Sure. I mean, this is a great example of European partnership right here. So I'm Carla Thomas from the British Embassy. And of course, this is a really timely conversation for us because, as I'm sure you'll know, we've just been working with the Germans, the French, and the United States to take action against Iran's transfer of ballistic missiles to Russia. And so I guess my question was sort of, how can we do more of that? How can the United States work more effectively with its traditional allies and partners to push back against these sort of malign influences that you outline?
Yeah, thank you. May I ask the question? So, Raphael Heinisch from the German Embassy. My question, unfortunately, goes in a slightly different direction, but I'll ask it nevertheless. So, you spoke about how to engage the undecided voter, and I found that very interesting. And you spoke extensively about the economic dimension and also the defense industrial dimension. My question is, where do you see, let's say, the military component of that, both in terms of force deployment, but also in terms of capacity building in engaging the undecided voter in the Middle East? Thank you.
Yeah, I just hit quickly on both of those. The second point is we are still the best security partner in the world. I guess if you had to pick one thing, and it's not that we aren't good at other things. We are good at other things. We can compete in a lot of different places. But the one area where clearly we are better than either Russia or China is in our ability to provide equipment and training and to maintain that equipment. You know, everyone in the world will say, well, you're the security partner of choice, even while they do buy some weapons from Russia and take other things. And I think we need to leverage that better. I think we need to work directly with those countries and see that. And then the second piece of the answer to that question is, you know, when you're going after the undecided voter, one of the key things is not come in and tell them what you think ought to happen. The truest thing that has ever been said to me is selling is listening. And that is one, you know, basically, how can I help you? You want to build a relationship? That's what you, how can I help? What's important to you? Okay? Instead of showing up and saying, here's what's important to us. China's a problem. Russia's a problem. Don't do this. Don't do that. No, just start by saying, you know, South Africa, Brazil, wherever. What's important to you? And how can I help with what's important to you? And that's how you start a relationship. So I think we need to work on that. As far as the partnerships, I think we're actually doing a pretty good job of, you know, of building with our traditional allies in a bunch of different ways. I would say I think our traditional allies need to up their game in terms of their defense capabilities. You know, and I don't have any criticism whatsoever of the post-World War II relationship. This notion that the U.S. You know, got taken advantage of because we defended all these countries is just ridiculous. Nobody benefited more from the security partnerships formed after World War II than the United States of America. Most, you know, powerful, richest economy in the history of the world because of stability. It was a bargain for us to spend the money we spent providing security for other parts of the world, all right? But the world has changed. There are needs that go beyond what we're capable of doing. So Germany, other countries, they got to get back in the game in terms of being more capable of providing security, certainly for themselves, but also working with us elsewhere in the world.
I think, too, it's an interesting question about, what do we do in response to the transfer of weapons, the short-range ballistic missiles from Iran to Russia. I think what we need to do is to look at, how did the formation of that transfer occur, and then look, too, about what led to Iran's capability to produce that. And then looking at saying, well, maybe some of the key components there that they receive in order to make this a viable enterprise, maybe we ought to look at some of those things. Are there places where we can be in that value chain to displace the things that they need, or to make sure that we have the ability economically to have an impact there? There are two ways to look at it. You can look at it as a post-response, or you can look at it to say, what can we do preemptively? I think this is a learning process for us to say, what can we do preemptively to look at the capability that these other nations are building, and ways that we can displace it within a free market realm. And it's to say, hey, listen, we have some power within that realm. It's always difficult afterwards to say, well, what do we do to create a penalty for that? And as we've seen, Russia and others are very good at circumventing that. All the things that we think will be effective are not always that effective. And remember, too, Russia has control over some things that other nations need. And if we don't provide them alternative, like for energy, if they say, hey, listen, we have to have energy from Russia in order to heat our homes in the wintertime, the United States says, well, don't buy it from them. And they go, well, then how are we going to keep a homes warm? And they go, well, that's your problem. No, that's not the way this works. That's not. That's right. It's all of our problem collectively. So we can't just tell folks, say no. We have to say, okay, let us give you some alternatives of what we can do collectively within the free market to make sure that we give you other alternatives. I think those things are key. As to the mill-to-mill relationships, I think we do a pretty good job in those areas of working with our allies. The question is not the folks that we exercise with now, that we do joint operations with now. I think we do a pretty doggone good job of that. And making sure we have interoperability, that's another key. But the key is how do we open that fold up? And for many nations that really have no military capability, it's not coming in and saying, hey, jointly exercise with us, because they don't have a lot to jointly exercise with us. But what we can do, and much along with the lines of Adam has said, and that is ask them the question, what can we do to enhance your security? What can we do for you to look to the United States rather than China for your long-term security, whether it's economic or strategic? I think we have a better scenario for those countries than China could ever provide to them, because I think they know at some point China's going to come knocking on the door and go, okay, we gave you security. This is what we expect in exchange. The United States have a record of not doing that transactionally. So we have to go in and say, what can we do to help? And we're not going to send you a bill for it. That's how we operate that makes us different from China.
We've clearly hit on a very strategic problem here that implicates whole of government and economy, and is going to be the challenge, I think, for at least a decade to come. We at CNAS will be working on this axis of upheaval, or CRINGE, certainly at least center-wide for the next year. But I really want to thank both Mr. Smith and Mr. Wittman for joining us today to discuss this issue. We look forward to being in close touch, working with you and the next administration on ways to solve this really intractable problem.
Well, Jonathan, thank you, and thank you to CNAS for sponsoring this. Adam, thank you for all that you do, for your leadership, and for being part of this panel.
Thank you as well. Really great work working with Rob. We didn't even get into how bipartisan, well, a little bit. The Armed Services Committee works very well together.
Very well.
And I really appreciate CNAS's leadership and insights on this issue. And thanks, Jonathan. It's good to see you.